The CEO stared at me over the pages of the report, the white light reflecting off the chrome edges of the desk, and said with the same casualness as ordering another coffee, "You've just been fired." I held my breath, felt Manhattan pulsing through the glass, and replied with icy calm, "Then I hope you enjoy working for me in a few months." The sentence hung in the air like an unsigned contract, and as I watched the Hudson slice through the city like a moving blade, I realized I wasn't leaving defeated, just repositioned on the board. My name is Michael Reed, 37 years old, CFO until 5 minutes ago, and everything I knew about corporate loyalty had just revealed itself as an expensive superstition. Logan Pierce offered no chair, no water, no pretense, just slid an envelope with the NDA across and pointed to the pen, as if my signature could seal my identity too. But numbers don't intimidate pens. Numbers are tides, and I had spent years mapping the discrete currents that sustained Apex dynamics. When I signed the document with a serenity I didn't feel, I memorized the rhythm of Logan's breathing, the nervous tick at the corner of his eye, the small crack in the confidence of someone who already considered himself invincible. Humiliation is long-term memory, and I would turn that memory into leverage. In the elevator, descending 35 floors of silence, my reflection in the polished steel returned a man who seemed lighter than he should, as if losing the badge meant shedding an invisible collar. I thought of the first spreadsheet I opened there, the budgets defended tooth and nail, and how on the eve of the IPO, I'd become a calculated risk to be removed. Outside, the wind smelled of gasoline and burning pretzels, vendors shouted, taxis honked, and I felt that cacophony was a heartbeat reminding me the city doesn't stop for anyone. So I decided I wouldn't stop either, and that my revenge would be as silent as stock exchange rules allow. On the subway to Brooklyn, I mentally revisited the preferred stock reports, remembered a footnote on liquidity discounts that few look at and almost no one understands, and saw there the outline of a loophole that, if exploited with patience and anonymity, could turn gravity in my favor. Arriving at the apartment, I opened the encrypted folder, retrieved the spreadsheets I'd kept out of professional obsession, and sketched, with pen and paper, the skeleton of a plan that rested on 3 pillars: invisibility, impeccable legality, and timing. Because revenge in the market is emotional arbitrage backed by legal collateral. I spent the whole night on encrypted calls, researching structures in Delaware, testing holding company names, and evaluating brokers with discreet reputations, not out of fear, but method. If I wanted the world to discover my name, I'd have a stage, and that stage would be the IPO bell. Before dawn, I closed the laptop, pressed my forehead against the cold glass of the window, and repeated to myself, with the conviction that only appears when a fall meets solid ground, they took my position, but forgot that true power, the kind that topples the CEO in full euphoria, is bought in silence and revealed at the exact moment.
When the sun touched the downtown buildings and the city lit up like a rising chart, I was no longer the fired employee trying to understand what happened. I was the anonymous investor, taking the first step, and I swore that every gavel strike on the exchange would record not just the value of Apex Dynamics, but the price of Logan Pierce's betrayal. The next morning tasted of metal and cold coffee, and as Manhattan opened its blinds, I opened an institutional account behind an LLC whose name meant nothing and everything: Iron Trust Capital. We trust iron because it bends with heat, and I intended to be the heat, the bend, and the final shape. James Holt, the broker recommended by a Harvard friend, answered with a neutral voice and precise questions, no unnecessary curiosity. I explained the buying profile, the need to disperse orders at asymmetric times, to use dark routes when possible, and to obey every regulatory comma as if my life depended on it. Between each call, I reviewed Apex Dynamics' public reports, cross-referencing disclosures with regulatory filings, and observing how market enthusiasm masks small governance inefficiencies that, isolated, were noise, but together formed a path. It was almost poetic to see how one management's arrogance creates the perfect scenario for a silent takeover. At noon, I bought the first crumbs. Nothing attention-grabbing. Trading volume for discretion, leaving trails that look like digital dust. The market saw some systematic investor, the desks saw liquidity, and I saw the first degree of freedom, that feeling that the board moves when you touch a finger in the right place. By late afternoon, I walked to a cafe in Williamsburg and met Sarah Mitchell, who still worked at Apex, and who looked at me with a mix of concern and exasperation. She said I needed to forget, move on, that life is bigger than a job. And I smiled without saying that my life now was an emotional engineering project with deadlines and metrics. When Sarah left, she left the old badge behind in a carelessness that didn't match the sharp memory I knew. I considered returning it right then, but the universe sometimes delivers tools with a blank ticket, and I accepted the coincidence like accepting a rare piece that fits effortlessly into the mechanism you're building.
That night, I called Evelyn Carter, an M&A lawyer I'd seen dismantle deals like opening safes with a stethoscope. I explained the operation's architecture, the need for total compliance, fiduciary shielding, and she, after a silence long enough to measure me, replied that she didn't work with revenge, she worked with structure, and mine was elegant. Hours later, already with initial opinions and a list of investment vehicles to form, I reread the firing scene like revisiting a movie for hidden clues. I realized Logan had no idea that numbers have memory, and that memory is the world's most exact revenge, because it doesn't forget, doesn't exaggerate, doesn't dramatize. It just adds up. Before bed, I recorded a short video for a personal finance channel where I sometimes appeared as an anonymous guest, without naming names, without giving clues, just leaving a reflection that would sound like consolation for those who don't know what I'm doing. Sometimes, losing your job is the best investment of your life, because it returns to you the one asset no one can price, the freedom to build your own board. Lying in the dark, listening to distant sirens like a city metronome, I understood that the fall had stopped echoing inside me and started echoing in the market, and that every discreetly executed order was a new beat, composing the soundtrack of what would become the biggest move of my career. I slept late, with the strange peace of someone who chose their own war. Iron Trust Capital was born from a dry PDF in Delaware, but it sounded like a drum in my chest. James Holt answered with the calm of someone crossing storms while reading newspapers. I explained order dispersion, dark routes, broken schedules, and invisible limits. He repeated each requirement like a pilot's pre-takeoff checklist. We closed the first purchase like signing a letter no one will ever read. The orders were small, precise, almost shy, dissolved in the exchange's noise. I preferred to lose speed for silence and accumulate room to maneuver. The market mistook me for some quantitative fund chasing minimal variations. I knew each tenth of a point prepared the turn that would come later. Revenge here seemed just discipline applied to patience. In the break, I reviewed disclosures, minutes, prospectuses, neglected footnotes. Apex Dynamics seemed armored, but every armor has joints, and every joint has slack. I mapped legal slacks, forgotten votes, and underpriced preferreds. The math smiled at me from the other side of the cold numbers, and the clock marked the exact rhythm of my future board presentation. That night, I recorded a short video for a finance channel without naming names. Sometimes losing the badge is gaining the wheel of your own story, I said. If anyone wants to follow turns like this, they know where to find me. No banners, no appeals, just value and an invitation for restless minds. I turned off the camera and turned on the next discrete execution algorithm. Before bed, I tested stress scenarios, drops, squeezes, and audits. Each path led to the same destination if I kept a steady hand. I bought another minimum lot, 1.5 points below consensus. I smiled without euphoria, like a runner finding the right stride. I was still invisible, but already occupying too much space to be ignored. The next day, the web stretched across Cayman, Nevada, and a trust in Boston. Evelyn Carter wasn't on the board yet, but compliance already guided everything. Each vehicle had purpose, walls, and numbered doors for the right auditor. I wanted the SEC to find exactly what it needed to find when it wanted. Surgical transparency is the preferred camouflage of those who don't miss a comma. Logan Pierce appeared on TV with the smile of someone already ringing the exchange bell. He spoke of mission, disruption, culture, and a future painted in long charts. I watched like a meteorologist measuring winds before the hurricane. The more he enchanted, the more my positions appreciated, and the irony made the coffee sweeter than it deserved. Execution continued with measured latency, sliced orders, and multiple destinations. No easy pattern, no lazy algorithmic signature. I preferred to seem like 10 indecisive people rather than one confident brain. If anyone chased my steps, they'd find dust and bifurcations. By day's end, the order book returned fractions that added up to intent.
In the afternoon, I reviewed voting agreements, tag-alongs, and statutory breaches. There were windows that only opened for those who arrived with key and scheduled time. I prepared the keys, scheduled the times, and left the right fingerprints in the right places. When the bell rings, I thought, the right door will open too, and someone will notice the room no longer has enough chairs for everyone. That night, I walked through Brooklyn, breathing the mix of rain and gasoline. The city seemed a living spreadsheet with columns of light and rows of concrete. I added streets, subtracted doubts, and multiplied conviction in my step. The plan had stopped being a hypothesis. It was a process in execution. And tomorrow, as always, the market would wake hungry for my silence. I met Sarah Mitchell at a small cafe on Fifth Avenue, the kind of place that seems to keep secrets under porcelain cups. She arrived with her usual firm step, her gaze calculating everything before even sitting down. "You need to stop this, Michael," she said, stirring her sugarless coffee, as she did when she wanted to pretend calm. I just watched, trying to understand if her concern was genuine or if it came from someone who still obeyed Logan Pierce. The conversation was a silent duel between someone who knew too much and someone pretending to know too little. She asked what I was planning, and I replied with the kind of smile that only fools those who want to be fooled. I said I was exploring new opportunities, that sometimes you have to lose everything to gain clarity, and she laughed, that short laugh that ends in suspicion. At one point, her eyes locked onto mine, and for an instant I saw the old complicity, the one born between spreadsheets and endless meetings. I almost told the truth, almost confessed the plan, but I held back. Silence, after all, is the safest investment there is. When she stood up, she left the old Apex badge on the table, forgotten by distraction or intent. I stared at that piece of plastic like it was a key fallen from a safe. I kicked up the badge and put it in my pocket, feeling the symbolic weight of a past I'd sworn to bury. It was curious how coincidences always appear when the plan starts to take shape. Sometimes fate has a sense of humor that borders on corporate irony. I returned to the apartment and, still with the badge in hand, accessed Apex's internal databases, which still had partial permissions active for certain ex-employees. The negligence was delicious, and in minutes I was reviewing minutes, control documents, and pre-IPO investment flows. I discovered Logan had inflated performance reports and used shell companies to mask debts, the same game he accused me of playing when he fired me. The difference was I knew how to hide my tracks better. Before bed, I reread the exchange with Sarah and realized that she, somehow, was still part of what I wanted to protect. Revenge pushed me forward, but the memory of her pulled me back. The balance between those two vectors was fragile, almost mathematical. Deep down, I knew she still believed in me, even without understanding what I was doing. And maybe that's exactly what made it all so dangerous. When morality mixes with strategy, the fall can be faster than a market in panic. Evelyn Carter's office was on the 26th floor of a building in Boston, with windows reflecting the city like a mosaic of glass and steel. She greeted me with a firm handshake and eyes that already calculated risks before even hearing the proposal. "Before we start, know that I don't work for people seeking revenge," she said, crossing her legs and opening her laptop. I just smiled, because what I had wasn't revenge. It was market correction. Revenge was just the name losers give to asset recovery.
I explained the plan with the coldness of an analyst at a quarterly conference. No emotion, no unnecessary verbs. I showed the holding structures, liquidity breaches, legal anonymity mechanisms, and institutional shielding clauses. Evelyn listened in silence, just typing notes as her reasoning ran parallel to mine. When I finished, she removed her glasses, stared at me, and said, "You'll need someone as immoral as meticulous, and I charge by the hour." For the first time in weeks, I laughed for real. We spent the following hours dissecting contracts and building layers of legitimacy that would make any auditor sleep soundly. Legal perfection is a labyrinth. The more you fill it with right paths, the less likely someone notices the trap. Evelyn was brilliant, objective, and seemed to enjoy creating the framework that would make it impossible to connect my name to future purchases. "That's a nice trick," she said. "You're buying the gallows and selling the rope at the same time." I just nodded and continued tightening the knot. When I left the office, Boston's wind cut my face like a blade. The city seemed less noisy than New York, colder, more rational, as if every corner demanded a decision. I called Holt and confirmed the second phase of acquisitions. He asked if I wanted to accelerate the process, and I said no. Power comes to those who know how to wait. As I hung up, I realized that phrase summed up my new life philosophy. I was no longer the wounded employee. I was the investor who learned to price pain and patience on the same curve. Back at the hotel, I sat by the window and opened the spreadsheet Evelyn had sent me. Codes, dates, company names, everything organized like a symphony of legality. I looked at my reflection in the glass and barely recognized the man watching me. He seemed calmer, more dangerous, the kind of calm that precedes an earthquake. Outside, the financial district lights pulsed like a night market, and in each flash, I saw a reminder. Every empire starts with a signature no one notices. That night, I climbed to the top of a building in Lower Manhattan, a silent rooftop overlooking the lights of the city that never sleeps. The cold breeze brought the metallic smell of wet concrete, mixed with the smoke from street restaurants still buzzing below. From there, I saw the Apex Dynamics tower shining, its logo pulsing like a constant reminder of my expulsion. I took out my phone, opened the camera reflection, and looked at myself. And in that instant, I realized what Logan had always wanted to turn me into. The difference was that now I was him, but without needing the mask of morality. The phone vibrated with a notification. Another batch of shares finalized successfully. The stakes were distributed across 9 vehicles, 3 countries, and a layer of anonymity even God would struggle to trace. James Holt sent a short message. "The board is ready." I read it, deleted it, and replied with a simple clock emoji, because time was the only asset that really mattered now. The wind picked up, and looking at the car lights below, I thought each headlight moved like a die rolling in my favor. Deep down, there was no luck, just statistics disguised as fate. I put the phone in my pocket and wondered what Logan was doing at that moment. Probably toasting with investors, selling dreams in colorful PowerPoints, while I bought the foundations of what he believed he controlled. It was almost poetic, almost fair, almost too beautiful to be a crime. I always thought power corrupts, but that night I realized it also purifies. Because only in absolute control does the truth reveal itself. And my truth was simple. I didn't want to destroy Apex. I wanted it to have the right owner.
I pulled a crumpled piece of paper from my pocket and wrote a phrase that came to mind. Business is war, and war has no friends. It's what Logan told me at the beginning, when we still pretended to be allies. I tucked the paper into my wallet, next to an old photo of Sarah, taken at one of those corporate events where we smiled like accomplices without knowing what awaited us. Sometimes I wondered if she still believed in redemption. I hadn't for a long time. What moved me now wasn't justice, it was precision. As the wind lifted my coat and the distant city noise turned to music, I realized something inevitable. I wasn't just avenging myself against Logan, I was becoming him, but smarter, colder, quieter. The difference between us was that he acted out of vanity and I out of calculation. The night sky reflected in the buildings like a cracked mirror, and in that reflection I saw myself divided between the man I was and the one I was about to be. I smiled at the abyss below and thought, sometimes the enemy is just the poorly executed prototype of what you're becoming. The morning of the IPO dawned golden, the kind of light only New York can produce when money is about to change hands. The exchange building buzzed with journalists, cameras, investors, and plastic smiles. Logan Pierce was at the center of it all, elegant in his custom suit, playing the visionary role with rehearsed precision. I watched from afar, among the crowd, with a temporary guest badge and a discreet smile. The sound of bells, applause, and flashes was a symphony of arrogance, and I knew the exact note that would follow. When the clock struck 9:30, the first bell toll announced the start of trading. Apex Dynamics shares surged 17% in under 10 minutes, and the hall vibrated like a stadium on finals day. Logan raised his hands, thanking investors, employees, the team spirit, and I almost laughed. At that exact moment, my Boston lawyer sent the final documents to the SEC. Evelyn Carter, with her firm voice, notified the system. A new majority shareholder had been identified. Michael Reed, 48% of Apex Dynamics' total shares. The silence that followed was absolute. Amid journalists and cameras, Logan blinked several times like someone trying to wake from an uncomfortable dream. An aide approached and whispered something to his ear, and his face lost color in real time. The cameras kept broadcasting live as the entire market processed the information. I took a deep breath and watched the scene like a conductor witnessing his perfect symphony. Each note played on time, each chord predicted. The difference was that this time the music wasn't celebration, it was surrender. As Logan tried to spin the situation, claiming error, fraud, or interference, I just left the building and walked to the corner cafe. I ordered a double espresso and watched my reflection in the glass. The whole world now knew my name, and for the first time, I didn't need to hide it behind a holding or a code. Michael Reed, the man fired before the IPO, was now owner of the empire that expelled him. I sipped the coffee slowly, savoring the exact bitterness of victory. Sometimes the taste of revenge is just coffee served at the right temperature. Back at the apartment, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists, investors, ex-colleagues trying to understand what happened. I didn't answer. I watched the sunset tint the horizon red, the exact color of a perfect turnaround. Outside, the city hurried on, but inside, everything was on pause. I'd won. And victory, unlike what leadership manuals preach, isn't euphoria, it's silence. Dense, heavy, absolute silence. The kind of silence that even the market listens to. The news spread like fire in digital gasoline, igniting the market and leaving reporters in a state of euphoria. Headlines cascaded. Ex-executive returns as majority shareholder and turns the tables on Apex Dynamics CEO. Logan Pierce became the face of corporate bewilderment, and every expression of his was analyzed in slow motion. Inside the company, chaos reigned, frantic messages, emergency meetings, and desperate attempts to understand the impossible. I watched it all from afar, with the serenity of someone who'd predicted every move of the collapse.
Evelyn Carter called me from Boston, laughing like someone who just watched a movie's plot twist. "You've just rewritten the hostile takeover manual, Michael," she said. I just replied, "Hostile is a subjective word." On the other end, I heard the clink of toasting glasses. Lawyers love clean wins. James Holt, always more practical, sent a short message. "The king has fallen." I closed the phone and kept watching the chart on the monitor, where the share price rose like a rocket, each dollar marking the rhythm of my revenge. In the Apex building, Sarah Mitchell watched the board's moral collapse. She sent me a message that seemed heavier than any report. "It was you, wasn't it?" I didn't reply, maybe out of cowardice, maybe pride. Part of me wanted to say yes, that it was all the result of a perfect calculation, but the quieter part knew revenge always charges emotional interest. I turned off the phone, stared at the ceiling, and realized that triumph is sometimes the muffled sound of a heart trying to remember why it all started. Logan tried to contact me, of course, first by email, then lawyers, then a letter sent to my new temporary headquarters. He claimed conspiracy, demanded explanations, appealed to our shared past. But I owed him nothing, just a reflection of what he taught me. Between the lines, I felt the desperation of a man who finally understood the price of arrogance. The difference was, I'd turned his pride into net worth. And as cruel as it seemed, there was something deeply just about seeing the master defeated by his own lesson. As Apex became the epicenter of global speculation, I prepared the next move, consolidate my position. Owning nearly half the company wasn't enough. I needed to dominate the board, decisions, narratives. And it all started the next day with an extraordinary meeting called by me. I smiled in the mirror and straightened my tie. The man reflected seemed calm, but his eyes said something else. Revenge doesn't end when the enemy falls. It ends when you take his place. And I was about to sit in the chair he thought eternal. The Apex Dynamics boardroom smelled of fear disguised as formality. Tight ties, untouched water glasses, and exchanged glances like blades. Logan was there, pale, trying to maintain the posture of someone who still controlled something. I entered with firm steps and the calm of someone dominating the battlefield.
The silence was instantaneous, heavy, almost solemn. "Gentlemen," I said, "I think we have a small governance matter to discuss." The irony was subtle, but every word had the weight of a verdict. Logan tried to speak, but I raised my hand. "No need, Logan. The market's heard your version. Now it's time for mine." I opened the laptop, projected the purchase reports, and displayed the impeccable trail of legality. Each acquisition, each contract, each audited and public signature. You fired me for being too meticulous, and that's exactly what brought me here. A murmur crossed the table, and one counselor, nervous, dropped his pen. Logan no longer looked at me. He looked at the floor, like someone finally understanding the geometry of his own fall. The board inevitably voted. It was almost symbolic. 6 votes in favor of replacing the presidency, 1 against, and a cowardly abstention that didn't change the outcome. Logan was officially out. "You can't do this," he said, voice choked. "I can, and I just did." I left the room without looking back, feeling the stares burning my back, not with hate, but fear. Fear of the man they thought they'd defeated, and who now commanded the empire. At the door, I paused for a second and said, "Business is war, and war is won with patience." Outside, the muffled sound of footsteps echoed in the marble corridor. Sarah waited in the lobby, her face divided between pride and astonishment. "You did it," she said, with a mix of admiration and reproach. "I warned you it wasn't about money," I replied, but she didn't believe me. Her silence was sharper than any moralistic speech. As the elevators rose and fell, I realized I'd won control of Apex, but lost the internal balance that once made me human. Power is a mirror that reflects the best and worst of whoever faces it.
That night, back in my apartment, I looked at the city from above and let the distant car sounds remind me the world kept turning. Logan, now deposed, was just a footnote in the story he himself wrote. I, on the other hand, had become the headline. But power, I discovered, is quieter than revenge. It doesn't shout, doesn't explode, doesn't avenge, it just weighs. And as Manhattan's lights blinked below, I realized the war was won, but the emptiness was still very much alive inside me. Logan Pierce went from innovation hero to corporate villain in less than 48 hours. The headlines that once celebrated him now dissected him with surgical precision, exposing every detail of the fraud he thought he'd buried. Investors demanded answers, the board avoided him, and the doors that once opened with smiles now closed with silence. I watched it all from afar, without apparent pleasure, just with the cold satisfaction of seeing mathematical justice fulfilled. Logan finally tasted the desperation that once made me bleed. That morning, I received an unexpected call. It was him. His voice was hoarse, laden with anger and fatigue. "You destroyed everything we built, Michael." I breathed deeply before replying. "No, Logan. I just showed you the cost of what you built wrong." On the other end, silence. He hung up without another word, and I realized his fall wasn't just financial, it was existential. The man who preached control was now hostage to the chaos he himself cultivated, and there was no bailout clause for one's own conscience. The media found in him the perfect symbol of modern power's decay. Newspapers splashed photos of him entering empty buildings, consulting lawyers, avoiding cameras. An ex-employee described him as a defeated general, still trying to give orders to an army that doesn't exist. I watched and thought how power is a cruel coin. It shines while it's yours, but weighs when you lose it. Logan was no longer my enemy. He was just the distant echo of a lesson I'd learned too late. Revenge, I realized, doesn't repair anything. It just replaces pain with silence. Sarah sought me out that same day, driven, perhaps by pity, perhaps curiosity. "You won, Michael," she said, with a look mixing respect and sadness. "But at what cost?" I didn't reply immediately. I just watched her, trying to decipher if there was still something between us that could survive the shadow of what I'd done. "Sometimes winning isn't about happiness. It's about balance," I said finally. She shook her head slowly and left in the air a light perfume that reminded me of days when ambition still didn't taste like iron. I didn't call her back. When night fell, I opened a bottle of wine and sat before the city lights. The distant siren sounds mixed with bar chatter, and everything seemed to spin around an invisible axis. The same axis I now commanded. Logan, somewhere, planned his escape or perhaps his return, but I didn't care. The empire was in my hands, and for the first time, the silence didn't hurt. It just existed, dense, heavy, real. I'd taken everything from him, and at the same time, something inside me began to empty. Taking command of Apex Dynamics was less a coronation and more an autopsy. The meeting room still smelled of Logan's cologne, and the walls carried the echo of decisions that nearly destroyed me. I walked the corridors observing faces that avoided mine as if they saw in me the mirror of what they could become. The victory was complete, but the feeling was strangely clinical, like I was just replacing the heart of a body that remained the same. Power, I realized, doesn't transform, it just changes the chair's owner. On the first day, I called a general meeting with all employees. I spoke of transparency, ethics, and reconstruction, words that sounded too right even for me. The applause was restrained, respectful, but empty. They didn't see a leader. They saw a warning,
And maybe they were right. I was living proof that success and disaster can share the same face. As I left the room, an older employee looked me in the eye and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Reed. I hope the victory lasts longer than the illusion." I smiled, but the phrase stuck in me like a sentence. In the afternoon, I visited Logan's office, now mine. I touched the desk where one day he signed my fire ring and felt the metallic surface the cold like a physical scar. I opened the drawer, and inside was a pen engraved with my name, an old gift, returned by him on my exit day. I held the object for a few seconds, and for an instant, the entire past condensed into a single gesture. I put the pen in my pocket and closed the drawer, calmly, like burying a body that's already served its purpose. The day ended, and I stayed alone, looking at the Manhattan skyline reflected in the office glass. The lights seemed slow pulses, as if the city breathed with me. I picked up the phone, opened the market app, and saw Apex shares surging even higher. Investors trusted, the market applauded, and I should have been happy, but I wasn't. Glory, when it arrives, isn't a shout. It's a whisper that asks, "Was that all?" And in that moment, I realized, yes, maybe it was just that. The top is just another kind of emptiness, with a better view. That night, leaving the building, I looked at the glowing Apex Dynamics sign. For an instant, I wanted to turn it off, extinguish the light, and disappear. But the world doesn't let winners disappear. It turns them into myths or monsters. I walked the wet sidewalk, neon reflections following me like old ghosts. I had everything I'd ever wanted: power, respect, control. And yet, the city seemed to ask me in silence, was it worth it? I didn't answer. I just kept walking because stopping would be admitting the answer might be no. Time passed like wind over concrete, invisible but relentless. The papers stopped talking about Logan and started talking about me, the new symbol of American corporate rebirth. I appeared on magazine covers, business panels, and gala dinners, but each flash seemed to steal a piece of my soul. People called me a visionary, but I knew I was just someone who learned to play the game better than the others. And in the power game, no one wins without paying the price. The only problem is the bill always arrives late. Sarah reappeared, as always, in silence. She entered my office with the naturalness of someone who'd known that space before it belonged to me. "You got what you wanted," she said, eyes wandering the walls, avoiding mine. "And you still think that makes me happy?" I replied. The dialogue was short, but the silence that followed was infinite. She looked at me like observing a stranger wearing the skin of someone she loved. I didn't try to justify myself. Whoever needs to explain their victories already knows they've lost. In the following days, I realized power isolates like a rare disease. Everyone listened to me, but no one truly heard. Meetings became rituals of obedience disguised as collaboration. Decisions seemed easier, but also heavier. With each signature, I felt the distant echo of the same coldness I'd once condemned in Logan. He'd shaped me without knowing it, and I'd let him. It was a perfect cycle, cruel and almost inevitable, as if the company itself were a mirror designed to reflect the ego of whoever commanded it. On a sleepless night, I revisited old emails, conversations, photos, memories that still smelled of hope. I found a message from Sarah, dated years ago. "One day you'll lose yourself trying to prove you were right." I smiled bitterly. It was almost prophetic. I closed the laptop, stared at the ceiling, and realized the loneliness of power doesn't come from the absence of people, but from the inability to trust someone without calculating the cost. Deep down, I no longer led a company. I managed an emotional empire and controlled collapse.
At dawn, I looked at New York's golden horizon and understood what I'd really bought with my 48%. It wasn't just control, influence, or status. It was a glass prison with a view of the entire world. And even so, inside, the air was starting to thin. Revenge had given me everything I asked for, but taken everything I needed. And in that morning silence, I realized the paradox that defines great winners. Everyone wants to conquer the world until they realize the world is an empty room with too much echo. Restructuring Apex Dynamics was the first step to saving something still worth it. I changed the ethics code, reviewed contracts, created employee stock participation programs, and encouraged the transparency I'd sabotaged years before. The market reacted with euphoria, and the numbers rose as if capitalism had a soul. But as metrics improved, my motivation waned. With each decision, I realized I was trying to fix what I'd broken. And fixing something is admitting deep down that you were the one responsible for the ruin. Employees started respecting me for real, but respect is a currency that doesn't buy peace. I smiled in meetings, greeted investors, and posed for photos, but nights remained long and the apartment increasingly silent. Sarah didn't return, and maybe it was better that way. Sometimes we need to lose witnesses to pretend the past didn't exist. Even so, every time I signed a new deal or approved a social project, I felt a timid spark of redemption, a brief flash of humanity trying to breathe under tons of calculation.
Evelyn Carter visited me on a Saturday, bringing a dossier on the company's future. "You're creating something good," she said. "But good doesn't erase the blood on the path." She always had that talent for telling the truth with the same tone as reading a contract. "I know," I replied. "But maybe erasing isn't the goal. Maybe the goal is to leave the right trail." She watched me in silence, assessing if I even believed my own words. When she left a sealed envelope on the table with a handwritten phrase, "Every purification starts with fire." In the following months, I started traveling outside the US, representing Apex at conferences and forums on business ethics. Irony or fade, I now spoke on integrity, transparency, and purpose. The audience applauded. Smiling investors surrounded me, and each flash reminded me the world loves to redeem those who fall beautifully. But inside me, something remained unfinished, a subtle crack no award or headline could fill. I'd built a legacy, yes, but it was born on ashes. Ashes that still carried the smell of my revenge. One night, returning from an event in Chicago, I entered the empty office and found the Apex sign partially out. An electrical fault, perhaps. I stared at that AP Dynamics blinking red, as if the company itself breathed with difficulty. And in that rhythmic flicker, I realized the empire I'd created still carried too many ghosts. I took Sarah's old badge from the drawer and placed it on the desk. "What would you think of me now?" I asked the void. No answer came. Just the distant neon hum reminding me that even the strongest lights one day need to be turned off. The following months ran with the methodical predictability of a stable market, but something in the calm surface always seemed suspicious to me. On a cold November morning, while reviewing reports, a discreet notification caught my attention. A new filing with the Securities Commission, an emerging Silicon Valley startup. The name made me freeze. Pierce Technologies. Logan was back. The man I'd dethroned, the symbol of corporate failure, had been reborn under another flag. I felt an old shiver run down my spine, the same cold that precedes war. I researched the project and found an almost poetic irony. Logan's company promised to redefine the future of ethical corporate governance. I smiled, a short and bitter smile. He'd learned from me.
or worse, copied me. Every line of the manifesto sounded like a parody of what I'd built at Apex. But the difference was, Logan knew how to play the martyr narrative, and the public loves a redemption story. For the first time in years, I realized the board was moving without my permission. And for someone like me, that was unacceptable. I gathered my team, requested reports, mapped investors, and cross-referenced stakes. Pierce Technologies was growing fast, aggressive, silent, exactly as I'd done years ago. History repeated, but in an inverted mirror. Evelyn Carter called. "You're gonna let this happen?" I replied without thinking, "Let it? I'm gonna watch." But it was a lie. The control instinct had already awakened, hungry. I knew revenge doesn't end when you win. It just changes direction. And now for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was defending an empire or my own reflection. That night, I walked the wet Manhattan streets, coat heavy and thoughts heavier. The lights reflected in puddles like shares oscillating on invisible charts. I thought of Sarah, Logan, myself. 3 variables in an impossible equation. I finally understood that power isn't possessed, it's just lent, temporarily to those brave enough to pay the price. I looked up at the Apex sign glowing like an open wound in the sky and felt something I hadn't in a long time. Anticipation. The war had changed addresses, but not purpose. Back in the office, I sat at the computer and opened a new file. I named it Project Redemption. The cursor blinked like an artificial heart, awaiting the first beat. I wrote the first sentence calmly. Every power story ends with the enemy's return. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and let the distant city sound fill the silence. Logan was somewhere across the country, rekindling the fire I'd lit years ago. I smiled, with almost dangerous serenity, and whispered, "If it's a war he wants, I'm ready for another round."